Hello, everybody. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming to SPOA's webinar today with Boston mayoral candidate Annissa Essaibi George. My name is Allison Drescher. I'm the president of SPOA, Vice President Amir Shahsavari, and I will be hosting you together for the next hour. We'd like to thank Annissa for coming and taking the time to talk to us today. Amir and I both came to SPOA approximately a year ago. Fear of what was happening to housing providers during the pandemic drove us to identify a group to get involved with. When eviction moratorium started during the COVID emergency, they seemed impossible. At that juncture, landlords started talking to one another. One of the first things we realized was that lawmakers were really only hearing one side of the story. Landlords are busy. We have families. Many of us have other jobs in addition to taking care of our property. We have children and parents, but we've been absent from the conversation. One of SPOA's main goals is to get legislators to understand that we are small businesses. Many of us are women, minority, and family-owned businesses. So we've not been on the playing field, and there's some distortion in the perception that we're all the greedy Ebenezer Scrooge model with cold hearts and endless pockets full of gold. Nothing is further from the truth, and SPOA is working hard to change that. We provide more than 60% of housing in Massachusetts. In the meanwhile, however, we are facing assault on many fronts. Eviction moratoriums control how and if we are compensated for providing housing. Proposed transfer taxes potentially cost us more money. Assistance programs are based exclusively on applications with either the tenant applying or requiring their assent. TOPA, or the Tenant Right to Purchase Act, now look to control how we sell our property. Frightening climate change legislation looms. Some in Boston looking to collect burdensome energy information in the attempt to ban fossil fuels. The question is real, and I'm hearing it more and more often. Is small property ownership in Boston viable anymore? That's why we have asked Annissa here today to hear her views on the important matters of housing and her proposals. There is a group of people who believe in cancel rent, and they believe housing is a human right. This used to be a covert effort, but it is very much alive and at the forefront, although there are no obvious plans as to how these proponents are going to shift housing from the private to the public sector. Again, small property owners provide 60% of housing in Massachusetts. Oftentimes people ask the question, why didn't anyone do something? We are now at that moment. SPOA is a volunteer organization and we need your help. We need funding to continue to provide programs such as this. So we ask you to consider how serious this moment is and to join SPOA at SPOA.com, become members and donate so that we can continue the important work we are doing. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Amir and he will introduce Annissa.
Allison, thank you for that. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the Vice President of SPOA. I'm also a small property owner myself. I work as a therapist during the day. I manage my property on the side. And I say that just to illustrate the point that I work hard, along with many other housing providers, to treat tenants like family. A lot of us have very good, nurturing relationships with our tenants. And unfortunately, we're in a situation right now where other forces are trying to manipulate those relationships for their own gain. And that's why landlords, housing providers, property owners all have to stick together to let the public know what's really going on, to let the public know that we definitely treat our tenants well, that we provide a very valuable service to those tenants. We have to maintain our properties for their sake, and not only for the tenants' sake, so that we can stay in business ourselves. And so we're very happy to have Annissa Essaibi George with us today. She did say that we could address her by her first name, just so you know. And so as the program continues, we will begin with Annissa delivering opening remarks. In the second portion of the program, Allison and I will ask some questions. And then in the third portion, we'll take some questions from the audience. If you're watching, you can feel free to type any questions in the box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to make sure that those questions are asked at the end of this program. And having said that, it's our pleasure to introduce Annissa Essaibi George.
Amir, Allison, thank you very much for bringing me on this evening or this afternoon, whatever time of day it is, and welcoming me to this webinar, to this conversation, to this dialogue about the very important work around housing our city's residents and the work that you all do in actively housing our city's residents. As you mentioned, my name is Annissa Essaibi George, and I'm very proud to serve as an at-large city councillor. I was elected the end of November of 2015, took office in 2016. So I've been in that capacity, in that position, in service to our city over these last almost 6 years now. I'm now looking to be mayor of this great city and hope to earn everyone's support over the course of today's conversation, but certainly reach out, communicate with me in our campaign. I'll share my information at some point over today, but you can also find me online. I think it's important to share a little bit about my story, how I landed in this position, and how I'm hoping to lead this city. As a councillor, I've been able to really insert myself in many conversations, especially as an at-large councillor, thinking about all of the work that we have to do as a city of Boston. Before joining the council, though, I was a high school teacher here in Boston and spent 13 years in the classroom at East Boston High. A great deal of that work has informed the places where I find my greatest opportunity for leadership on the council around serving our kids, supporting a high quality education across the board, and having an opportunity to get into the weeds as well. I'm a graduate of the Boston Public Schools. My husband and I have 4 kids who are all in the Boston Public Schools. He as well is a graduate of BPS. Before joining the council, I also had the opportunity to be involved in my community, to be involved in the neighborhood of Dorchester that I call home, and to be engaged in civic action and civic activity. And for me, my desire to be involved, to be engaged in politics, to be engaged in community and our city, especially at the municipal level, started when I was a high school student at Boston Tech, which is now the O'Briens. And during those high school years, I found my political, I think, voice, or a little bit of that passion to get engaged in government, especially at the local level. As a high school student, actively engaged in student council and student government, became a member of the Boston Student Advisory Council, and eventually found myself engaged in the work at a statewide level, and just really recognized at a very young age how important local government was to me as a high school student, but also how important local government was across the board. When we think about issues, certainly of education, but of public health, of public safety, of transportation, of public works, thinking about filling potholes and building playgrounds, and certainly around housing and the supports that need to be in place to support some of our more vulnerable residents, but also the work that we need to do in partnership with those. And as you mentioned, Allison, I think in your opening remarks, about the impact that small property owners have on housing our city's residents. So I'm excited about today's conversation and look forward to getting to it. So here I am.
Well, thank you very much. As you know, the term affordable housing has been floated around quite a bit. There are different versions of it. Do you have a definition of affordable housing for the city of Boston?
Yeah, no, there is certainly a great deal of discussion around creating opportunities for affordable housing and more affordable housing, and then truly affordable housing. And along that spectrum, for me, the definition of affordable housing is supporting our residents and meeting them where they are at that moment of time. And there's certainly the debate around rental affordability and using the AMI, the area median income, to determine that affordability. There's also a question around affordability as it relates to ownership. I think that we should, as a city, be looking for more opportunities to create ownership opportunities for our city's residents. As we know, most of this city is a rental market, but as an at-large city councillor and as the next mayor of this city, I want to make sure that we are always continuing to create opportunities for families to invest more into this city and to create opportunities for them to own, to set down roots, to grow their families. I think also, we have to just very simply acknowledge that this city continues to be very expensive for many of our city's residents. And it's our small property owners, it's those that have maybe just a few units that are actually creating some of those truly affordable opportunities across our city. We have seen for sure a gap between our low and our middle income families around accessing affordable rental and ownership opportunities in this city. We know that the luxury market will take care of itself, and the extremely low income market generally takes care of itself through government subsidies and government interventions. For me, as we look to define affordability, we also need to make sure that we're always looking for ways to create additional stock, that we are building in this city. This city will continue to grow. We need to make sure that we are building to respond to the growing population, that we are creating also a diversity of units as they come on market. We think about, you know, the 1 bedrooms, the 2 bedrooms, and then family-sized housing in this city, and that we are creating you know, a response to that affordability question along the spectrum, so that we are meeting the needs of our city's residents across the board. When we get down to it, we need to make sure that the affordability definition meets the needs of our city's residents across the board. And it is, again, it's that spectrum. It is sometimes, and will continue to be, I think, for at least the interim, a moving target when we think about truly affordable housing in our city.
And when you talk about that spectrum, and when you talk about the diversity of affordable housing, would workforce housing and middle income housing be included in that as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, workforce housing and middle income housing is where our targets are. We're missing the target when we think about our residents and our families who don't qualify for the lower income housing or subsidized housing, but they still are having trouble paying their rent or their mortgage. This also includes our city's workers. And I think about my job, especially as mayor, the task at hand is to make sure that we're building and creating enough, you know, of this quote unquote affordable housing in our city for our city's residents. And there has to be, as mayor of the city, as the leader of the city, as the chief executive of this city, that we're creating housing that our workforce across the board, but certainly the city's workforce, can afford. And we do that by increasing our housing stock and ensuring that we are meeting the diversity of needs across that spectrum. We know that the high takes care of itself and the low generally does, certainly with government support and government intervention, but it's that middle piece when we think about workforce and middle income housing that is more difficult to build. We have to, as a city, invest in those opportunities, make it easier for those units to come online across the board in all of our neighborhoods. It's really important. It has to be a focal point. We are quickly, as a city, losing our middle class, losing our working class, losing those that are working for this city to suburban communities, especially with, you know, our city. We have residency requirements with that, which I'm supportive of. When they hit that 10-year mark, they're leaving our city for more affordable options outside of our city and more appropriately sized units outside of our city.
And having said that, do you envision a future where government can incentivize and partner up with small property owners to make the housing and provide it?
Oh, I think we absolutely have to. That's necessary. We can't just simply focus on large scale developers to continue to build our city. It's pockets of the smaller sized projects and smaller housing units that are making the difference when it comes to our families and when it comes to that truly affordable housing that is not either formally restricted or formally supported by subsidies. We have to do this work in partnership, and that goes for, you know, every component of our society. Every component of the work that I will do as mayor has to be done in partnership with those that have a particular expertise in this work. And when we think about our housing stock across the city of Boston, we need to work with those that own it. And if we're looking to create more opportunities, we need to let you inform that work for sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Allison, I'll turn it over to you if you want to follow up.
Well, I know Mayor Walsh had a goal that was revised from the original goal, but I believe at last count it was 74,000 units of housing that he wanted to create. I know living and being part of a neighborhood like South Boston, where there's been just massive development on a massive scale. Where are we with the 74,000 units created? And of that development, how many of those units are affordable?
So first, we've been successfully increasing the housing supply here in the city of Boston, especially after several decades of very little growth. We know that it's still not enough, and we continue to have a housing shortage here in the city of Boston, especially as our city continues to experience growth and attract new residents. It's critical that we continue to work to meet those very ambitious housing goals, but that we're also doing that growth in a smart way, that we're thoughtful about how that growth looks and how it impacts our local neighborhoods. Certainly, as mayor, I will continue to leverage new development to create better connected, mixed use and mixed income housing in our city's neighborhoods. And that's how we build better, stronger, more resilient neighborhoods across our city. It has to be reflective of the needs of our communities. It has to certainly be responsive to the growing population in our city, and also reflective of what our residents are asking for. Again, when we think about whether it's, you know, a young person just starting out here in the city of Boston, a family looking to grow, or an older Bostonian looking to retire in community, perhaps close to home, and within the community, the network, the neighborhood that they've helped build. I think that we've hit the 50% mark or so when we think about the goal of building new housing here in the city of Boston. I think we will continue, certainly under my leadership, we will continue to be ambitious and aggressive in that building. We also need to reform our city zoning and development process to make it easier and faster to build that housing supply that our city needs, especially with projects that are centered around increased affordability and variety, and really paying particular attention to my desire, and I think a general desire, to keep our working families here in the city. You know, that's got to be important. It's got to be central to the work. And, you know, so to really make sure that I'm answering your question, we're about halfway there, but we've got more to do. And I think that those initial goals of, you know, I think we started at 53,000, maybe 69,000, and you mentioned here the 74,000 goal. We've got almost double of that's needed here in the city of Boston. And while we build the city, we need to make sure that we've got transportation that works, that we've got, you know, when we think about public safety and our first responders on staff to be able to respond to a growing population, that we have continued investment in our public education here in the city of Boston, that we also have the other amenities, you know, because public safety, for example, is not an amenity. We need to make sure that as the city of Boston grows, that we've got a transportation and a public transit system that can respond to that, that we've got police and fire and EMS that are equipped to respond to a growing city, but that we also have a robust park system, that we've got youth programming in place to support what I hope is growing the number of families who choose to stay and are able to stay in our city, that our schools can respond to growth, which, you know, I'm certainly committed to doing. So there's lots of components that go into a growing city, and a lot of things that we need in place to support that growth.
And one thing we are definitely hearing from small property owners is that the types of challenges that we're facing are really making people rethink property ownership as it becomes more and more arduous. And there was even a recent discussion, SPOA was testifying on some of the housing court issues for Massachusetts. And one of the legislators said that landlords really need to step up and be part of the safety net. And there's sentiment that it's just getting too hard. It's getting really difficult to provide housing. So preservation of housing is certainly going to be a big issue, I think, in Boston as the city grows. Do you have any views on how we can help keep our small property owners in business?
When we think about small property owners, I have to, think back on my own housing story and my own experience growing up in this city. I'm the daughter of immigrants. Both my parents immigrated to the United States. Two slightly different stories. My mother is Polish. My grandparents, my grandmother in particular, at the age of 14, was taken from her home in Poland to work in a labor camp in Germany. My grandfather was in the Polish army, became a prisoner of war. They met in a displaced persons camp where my mother was eventually born. They moved or immigrated to the United States from that DP camp, slowly made their way first to New York, then to the West End, and then displaced from the West End, found and stayed with a host family in Dorchester, and eventually got to a place where they could buy their home. So for my grandfather, it was important to buy a multifamily home, and in fact bought one that had a storefront because he was a TV and radio repairman, and he wanted to be able to operate his business from his home. So there's sort of lots of things happening in that house. That's the house that my mother, calls home still today. It's the house that I grew up in, and it's the storefront that I'm running my campaign for mayor out of, which is, very sentimental and a little emotional for me. But for my grandparents, that home became a stabilizing force. The day that they could purchase that home, they had tenants in the other 2 floors. My grandfather operated his business out of that storefront that helped put food on the family for my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother still had to work to help support the family, but for them, it was the stabilizing force in their life. And after being displaced, literally, after being in a camp and, facing lots of trauma, facing poverty, eventually being able to immigrate to the United States and fulfill, this American promise that we all talk about, home ownership is an important piece of that. And through that experience, it created stability for our family, and creates and leads to generational stability. And I think about the role that can play for so many of our city's families, especially when you think about the city of Boston and the prevalence of multi-unit homes. When we create those opportunities and encourage opportunities for home ownership that also includes tenancy, that's really fantastic. And that's where we find families being able to support themselves and each other, families being able to create that stability for their children, families being able to create stability for their community, and then creating opportunities for generational wealth and a certain legacy. So I think that we absolutely need to preserve this type of housing, that simply for the fact that it helps families and it helps communities. And when we think about, especially this pandemic, we think about the risk of recession, we have to think about strengthening our city's economic standing. And that starts with strengthening our families across the board. So certainly an important part of my own personal story. And I think when we work to make that a part of the story of our families across the board, we do so much more as a city that we can't even ever necessarily touch and feel.
Thank you, Annissa. Yeah, on the subject of immigrants and your personal story, I appreciate your comments, because we have spoken to many housing providers who are first-generation immigrants, second-generation. They tell us that they came to America to fulfill the American dream so that they could give back to their communities by providing housing, and doing so using their own creativity, their own ingenuity. And now they feel that the American dream is under attack, given all of these anti-property owner proposals that are coming. And that leads us into the question of rent control. At various points during the campaign, other candidates have proposed bringing back rent control as a means of keeping housing affordable. But at the same time, they also talk about increasing the supply of housing. Do you agree with them, or do you think that what they're talking about is a contradiction?
No, it's certainly a contradiction. I do not support rent control in this city. We all agree that housing is too expensive for too many families in Boston. And if we want our city to grow and thrive, and I certainly do, we need to address the question and the challenge of housing affordability. But rent control is not the answer to that problem. Rent control, we know, decreases affordability, fuels gentrification, and pushes people out of our city's neighborhoods. With rent control, we know the price of surrounding units will increase, and it puts low-income renters at a huge disadvantage to access those units, especially when we think about our working poor families in our city. We cannot afford to push our, especially our working poor families further and further away from job centers and public transit. It's the absolute opposite of what we want to do. And, I think rent control and the hashtag of rent control is, just that sort of flash in the pan. It's maybe a sexy statement for a moment, but it does not help families. It does not help our lowest income renters across the city of Boston, and it does not create opportunities for true investment in our city's neighborhoods and for our families to look for opportunities to purchase. We need to get to the root of the problem, and that is creating those better paths to home ownership by creating and building more affordable and truly affordable housing in our city, creating opportunities for generational wealth, and dismantling systems that are broken and increasing access to opportunities in every neighborhood of our city. We've got for sure the proof that rent control leads to disinvestment, that it maybe supports a family for a brief moment in time, but we know it limits the amount of rental market units on the marketplace. It impacts the market and will likely, I think, very dramatically increase rental prices in our city. We need to do the opposite of that right now. We see this crunch and this pressure on our marketplace today. It is an unnatural force that will disproportionately impact our lower income working families and working class here in the city of Boston. We know the luxury can take care of itself. We know that our extremely low income families have opportunities within the subsidized market, which we need to do more of, and that should be government's role in this work, but it doesn't come in the form of rent control.
And continuing from those points, we've heard a lot about how tenants would suffer from, being left with decayed housing and less housing options. But there's another angle as far as the concerns that property owners have that doesn't really get heard too often. And it also goes back to the way that rent control was implemented in the 70s and 80s. There were a lot of built-in mechanisms in which it became almost impossible for landlords to collect their hard-earned income. It also became nearly impossible for property owners to remove tenants who were not compliant with the terms of their leases. This included tenants who committed acts of vandalism. Landlords also had to face off against rent control attorneys who really defended the tenant no matter what. Instead of viewing it as a two-way street, it was a very one-sided situation where they were defending bad behaviors on the part of some tenants anyway. And then you had in other places rent control boards, which were more like rent control tribunals. If a landlord wanted to make a repair or a needed renovation, either for the benefit of the property and the benefit of the tenants, the rent control tribunals would delay the process. They would make the landlords wait for very long periods of time and then ultimately deny the request to make repairs, because in their view, to improve a property was really the equivalent of a sin. And at the same time, there were other cases where, just out of pure spite, the tribunals would force some landlords to make renovations that were not only super expensive, but completely unneeded and unrealistic. And there was one situation in the 80s where one property owner went home after a very contentious hearing in which the tribunal asked him to literally raise the foundation of his home. And 2 days later, he had a heart attack. So having said that, we have heard a lot about tenant protections, which are important. They're definitely important. But do you have any comments about ways that government can help increase landlord protections so that there will be a fair level playing field for both housing providers and their tenants as well?
Yeah, no, we certainly need to make sure that all voices are at the table and have an opportunity to inform the work that we need to do, whether it's creating additional housing stabilizing housing, and also protecting tenants. And I appreciate that you recognize that certain tenant protections are necessary and appropriate to have in place. And that's work that we certainly have to do, especially as we think about the implications of COVID. We have to recognize the devastating financial impact this pandemic has had on all industries, especially housing. We've seen the economic impact that this has had on our residents. And, you know, when we think about the impact on our working poor, we also have to make sure that we are understanding and appreciating the impact that it has had on the small landlord. And that small landlord could be someone like my grandfather, who was using that commercial space to do his business, to grow his business, to feed his family, and relying on the other rental income to pay the mortgage, to pay some of the household bills. That for sure has to be part of all of our conversations and all of our considerations. And we also need to recognize and appreciate that it's our smallest landlords that are providing that most affordable housing, especially for our working families across this city of Boston. In order for us to have this strong recovery, we need to be, I think, equally committed to understanding the experience of our tenants and our small landlords across the board. It's why I've been so supportive and vocal around my support of our Office of Housing Stability, which should be working in better partnership, I think, with our tenants and our small landlords, but increasing the efforts that go into that office, increasing the funds that go into that office and the support that comes out of that office for both tenants and small landlords, I think is an important component. But I also think that it's important to hear from small landlords across the city to inform the work of that office, because where that housing stability comes from is from that small landlord. So that's, you know, an important component of this work for sure. And making sure that the work that happens, especially through the court system, for both tenant and landlord, is done quickly, is done thoughtfully, and is not dragged out month after month and sometimes year after year. That is not supportive of family or landlord. And we have to, you know, also recognize that many of our small property landlords are also the families that are housed in those units. So there's, you know, this special ecosystem that exists that we need to appreciate and make sure that we're allowing to inform the work, especially at the city level.
Well, thank you. And I just want to reemphasize that point. We are definitely committed to doing what's right for our tenants while advocating for ourselves as landlords. It is a two-way street, and there should be fairness and protections for everyone. And if I understood you correctly, you would, if elected mayor, you would favor a situation or an arrangement where both landlords and tenants could come to the table to discuss their concerns on an equal basis.
Yeah, no, absolutely on an equal basis. And, you know, you got to inform that work. You're, you know, in many cases, our small landlords are residents in the city as well. And, you know, that voice, that experience, what you're doing, especially providing additional housing units in the marketplace, is an important one. And you should be informing this work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, that brings us to the important discussion about eviction moratoriums. And that was certainly something that was very challenging for landlords to understand. I think on the tenant advocacy side, there was a lot of discussion about predicted tsunami of evictions. Mm-hmm. And the data that we are seeing is that tsunami of evictions did not happen. And it largely did not happen because landlords worked out arrangements with tenants. But when we get into the very tricky situation of eviction moratoriums, we're providing blanket legislation. We're a step away from disincenting tenants to pay. There are plenty of people who remain employed. There are plenty of people on fixed incomes. So then the Boston City Council enacts their own eviction moratorium. And Cambridge and Somerville have done the same thing. But the struggle for small housing providers is we're working through the governor's office. They roll back the state of emergency. And then we're not even sure it's lawful, as it is not have had a home rule petition process. have not mounted a court challenge, so we certainly don't know, which is lengthy and time consuming and expensive for housing providers. So what is your view? I think there's also a misunderstanding. We really can't control our property if we can't evict tenants. If we have issues with not only non-payment, but safety issues for other tenants. And that is just becoming a really frightening reality for us as they continue discussing continuances, more time, and then local municipalities are adopting their own rules, overriding state law.
So first, I don't believe that the council took a vote on the citywide eviction moratorium, so there wasn't a vote on it in that measure. As of right now, the city is, and the administration is operating under the federal moratorium. And I would oppose a citywide eviction moratorium out of the concerns of how it would impact our housing market. I also think it's important to note the state moratorium is, the eviction piece is contingent upon a relationship with a local housing authority and an office of housing support like we have in the city of Boston. I think that our responsibility is to increase our efforts as a city to connect residents to rental relief opportunities, and as well as our small property owners. They should be connected to those rental relief opportunities as well. When we think about what's happened over this last year and a half, in particular, our small property owners who are also small business owners have been greatly impacted and affected by the economic challenges that COVID has brought to our city. And we have a responsibility to support both our tenants, our city's residents, and our small business owners who are, in many cases, in all cases, if you're a small property owner, you're a small business owner. So we've got work certainly to do to increase and enhance our support for all parties in this conversation. Certainly, we want to limit evictions. I've done a great deal of work on the city council supporting families who are experiencing homelessness, responding to the needs of individuals who are unsheltered, supporting our shelter system here in the city, and working in partnership with emergency efforts at the state level to support families who are unsheltered. And we've got work to do, but it has to happen in partnership. And small property owners who have access and operate and oversee so many of the units, especially here in the city of Boston, need to be a partner in this work. We shouldn't be painting with a broad brush that because you own your multifamily home, because you own units in the city of Boston, that you are somehow an enemy and in conflict with that work. Quite the opposite. You should be, and in many cases, you are partners in our city's response to supporting families who are experiencing homelessness, to providing that affordability that so many of our city's residents need day in and day out.
When it comes to the eviction process, and in the spirit of strengthening that partnership between property owners and government, we often feel that people in government don't really understand, what we go through when evictions happen. And I know that you can't speak for everyone, but we're curious to know, generally speaking, when you speak to other people in government, do you think they're conscious of various issues, including, for example, if you think about how evictions really work, more often than not, landlords typically forego a lot of money, thousands of dollars in unpaid rent, just so that they can get possession of their units back in order to re-rent them again. And, generally, do you think enough people in elected office understand the challenges that are associated with going through very long, drawn-out eviction processes where landlords typically incur a lot of expenses, only to try to start over again without, believing that stereotype that we chase after our tenants like these evil ogres, when we typically don't do that. Eviction is a last resort. It is often, almost always, a last resort for the landlord. And so do you think that more work has to be done for people in government to understand that in the process of encouraging mutual understanding as well as partnership?
I mean, there's a very simple answer to that question. Yes, I think more work needs to be done to make sure that public officials and elected officials, those that work in government, who are policymakers, who are putting in place the policies or legislation that is passed by elected bodies, they need to be more informed. They need to have a deeper understanding and certainly a better appreciation for the challenges that you all face. I think the cure to that, the fix to that, is making sure that small property owners have an opportunity to inform the work, have an opportunity to be at the table and to participate in these discussions. And, you know, I think that is how we find solutions to these most pressing issues. And when we have these meaningful conversations, when you have an opportunity to inform the work, I think the system becomes more predictable, easier to navigate. And I think when we do that, when we fix the system, when we repair the breaks in the system, both for a tenant and small property owner, it creates an opportunity to have a system that's more reliable, a housing system that's more reliable. And that there creates opportunities for greater affordability. So if there is less, when the system is easier to navigate for you as a small property owner and for the tenant, it creates opportunities for greater affordability and less risk, or less risk creates greater affordability. And when we have a marketplace that we can depend on, that we can trust in, that's better for everybody.
Right. We had one of our members come, write a question where he asked if elected mayor, would you be open to having property owners give educational or continuing education seminars to people in government in public forums in front of not only elected officials, but tenant advocates as well, just so that both sides can reach common ground?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's critically important. I think it's also important for small property owners to share their knowledge, to share their experiences, to educate our city's residents who may want to explore becoming small property owners. We think, it may on paper appear glamorous to own a 3-family home that you also live in, but there's a lot of work that comes with that. There is a need for education and information, and we talk about technical assistance in the small business world. When we think about a new business that's coming online and the supports they need, whether it's around developing banking relationships, whether it's around marketing, whether it's around getting their products set up online. There is the same education, a similar education that should happen for our city's residents who may want to purchase a 2 or a 3-family or a multi-unit building. And who better to learn the business from, who better to understand the components to doing that successfully than a small property owner, him or herself.
Thank you. Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
I just had a couple of tax questions for you. The commercial tax base funds 70% of the city of Boston's budget, correct?
All property tax.
Okay. And so the millionaire's tax is something that's being floated as a ballot initiative. And that is, we get some feedback from our members that it's not completely clear in that initiative that would include real estate sales over $1 million. So we obviously want to make sure that our members understand that. We wanted to ask you what your stance is on the millionaire's tax.
So I do support the millionaire's tax and that legislation, because I think it would play a really critical role in our city's effort, my effort as a city councillor today, and as mayor, I hope in the next few months, to invest in things like public education, housing, certainly our city's infrastructure and beyond. I do believe that we need to be intentional when it comes to implementation to ensure that we don't have unintended consequences, especially on our small business owners and our longer term residents here in the city of Boston. The millionaire's tax, my understanding is that's different than the transfer tax. That I'm sure maybe you'll have a question around. They are two different things. And this is not directly related to real estate holdings and transactions.
And the transfer, so there have been a bunch of different tax proposals floated. The transfer tax, there was some initial discussion that seemed to have not gotten too much traction, which was the dark windows tax or the foreign investment on the luxury end of the units. What is your position on transfer taxes, surtaxes, transactional taxes?
Especially at those higher levels, I do generally support them. I think that it's, opportunities for us to increase revenue here in the city of Boston and statewide. We've got to make sure, though, that when we are passing these bills, this legislation, that we're very clear what it means, and that we are always looking out for the unintended consequences. We don't want to create a system in which we're disincentivizing housing production, where we're disincentivizing growth, especially economic opportunity. When we think about the commercial side of the market, we want to make sure that new industry can find home here in Boston, that we know that we have an opportunity for our city's residents to be a part of the workforce and gain economic employment and opportunity. I'd also say that, this runs certainly along the lines of pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes. We have large institutions, our hospitals, our universities, our cultural centers here in the city of Boston, because of their nonprofit status, they're not paying property taxes, which, as you mentioned, Allison, is 70% of our city's revenue. And all of that goes to basically to our operating and our city being able to function and fulfill the roles and responsibilities it plays. But, for me, I've made a promise on the pilot piece in particular, because everyone needs to pay their fair share. Everyone needs to participate in the economic stability of our city and, contributing to our city's revenues. So in my first 100 days in office, I will reconvene the pilot task force, make sure that they have a seat at the table, that we are reevaluating their property holdings across our city, because we can't put this burden simply on one industry, simply on one type of property owner or property holder. We've got work to do to make sure that there is equity across the board in that in particular.
And on that subject, given the 70% figure that Allison mentioned, as you know, during the pandemic, property owners have been asked to provide an essential service to further shelter tenants, regardless of their ability to pay rent. The current assistance programs force landlords to have the compliance of their tenants to even apply. What's your remedy to helping housing providers where $47 billion have been allocated, but only $3 billion right now is in the hands of suffering landlords for rental relief? How do you think this impacts Boston's housing market in the longer term?
Well, I think it creates some anxiety in the marketplace for sure. And I think that there needs to be a place for our small property owners to engage with our Office of Housing Stability, that it shouldn't just be the responsibility of the tenant, or if the tenant isn't engaging in these conversations with the Office of Housing Stability, for instance, that there's no opportunity for relief through that office. We need to make sure that there are a multitude of ways in which for small property owners to engage with our city and to access some of those resources.
Thank you. Allison?
We were, Amir, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the landlord-tenant alliance.
Sure. Well, one idea that some housing providers have been discussing is the unfortunate perception regarding hostile, landlord-tenant relationships, which we mentioned earlier in the program. Many of us value our tenants. We get along with them very well. The relationships are very nurturing. And so in order to combat this understanding, some of us were talking about the potential to form landlord-tenant alliances where, it could take many different forms, but as one example, there could be potential programs that we could advocate for where landlords educate and train tenants with regard to different aspects of home ownership. Certain responsibilities could be shared per agreement between the two parties, including repair and maintenance costs, as well as, sharing other responsibilities. And moreover, Do you think that there are potential cost-saving programs where, landlords and the city could work together to pool resources in order to provide incentives for housing providers so that they can create new opportunities towards home ownership for their tenants?
There's a lot of questions in there, but I think, yes, the answer is yes to all of them. When we create opportunities for home ownership in our city, it has such a compounding effect on our families, on our kids, on our neighborhoods, on our city as a whole. And this truly has to be a place where we focus our investments and where I, as mayor, can leverage my authority, my power, my voice. I think that we have to take an inclusive and collaborative approach to this work. It's certainly my style as a city councillor, what I hope to continue as mayor, and you can only see what I would do as mayor by looking back to see how I've performed as a city councillor. And that is for sure making sure that all voices and stakeholders have an opportunity to be at the table. And as I mentioned in an answer to an earlier question, that when we create those opportunities for you to work in partnership with your tenants, to educate them, to inform them, to guide them, and perhaps help them create their own opportunity within property ownership, within small property ownership, that creates those permanent pathways to generational wealth, to home ownership, to supporting families. And we can do this by doing this work together, quite simply. And I think it's an incredible opportunity when we have that alliance, especially when we're allying two groups of people that society has said are in conflicting positions. You aren't. We need, landlords need tenants, tenants need landlords, but it doesn't mean that that is the relationship that has to exist for all time. We can turn tenants into homeowners. And in fact, many will. Why not embrace that relationship, create opportunities for that relationship to flourish? And the city should play a leading role in sort of in creating that collaboration, sort of setting the table for that to happen.
Well, we appreciate your comments. And before we wrap up today, is there anything else that you would like to tell our viewers?
I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to all of you, to talk to your members of your organization, and to discuss how important your job is, your task is, in housing so many of our city's residents. And as mayor, I'll be committed to continuing and expanding these opportunities. I think that affordable housing is a critical need here in the city of Boston, and in partnership, we can make sure that happens, and that we are responding to the creation of truly affordable housing, and then working with our city's residents to look for opportunities for home ownership, to create that pathway for home ownership. I appreciate that your housing that your members create is housing that is occupied by our city's residents, and often also occupied by the property owner, him or herself. So I'm committed to supporting that work. I'm committed to helping you create more affordable housing across our city. And alongside that parallel work, making sure that as a city, that we are creating those pathways to home ownership. I'm willing to and will invest city dollars in down payment assistance. And especially when we talk about first generation home buyers and first time home buyers, two slightly different categories of home ownership opportunities, but that we can all do together. So I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to talk, to be in partnership with all of you. We've got work to do, and the only way to do it successfully is if we do it together.
Thank you. On behalf of the Small Property Owners Association, we really thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. We wish you the best of luck, and we also hope that there will be other opportunities where we can talk again in the future to discuss these important issues. Yeah. We thank Annissa Essaibi George, and also to the viewership, to the people watching. It's very important for all of us to come together. We ask you kindly to donate to the Small Property Owners Association so that we can continue the important work covering the different areas that were discussed today during this webinar. So please donate at our website. And Allison, do you have any closing comments?
No, thank you. It was a real pleasure to spend a little bit of time with you and to hear your views about housing. And we look forward to watching you between now and the 14th of September. So So thank you for spending some time with us.
Thanks, Allison. I hope all your viewers who are Boston residents will not forget to vote September 14th. I'm #1 on the ballot and look forward to leading the city.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.